Jim Parsons sat across from the most powerful showrunner in television and said something that would quietly end a billion-dollar franchise. No shouting, no lawyers, no salary ultimatums leaking to trade publications. Just a man in a living room on a Sunday afternoon finally saying what he had been rehearsing in his own head for months. What led him to that conversation is a story about grief, mortality, and the kind of exhaustion that never appears on a call sheet. And it starts not on a sitcom set, but in a hospital corridor at 2 a.m, staring at an x-ray of his own broken foot, running a calculation about his father's age that he had spent years trying not to finish. For 11 seasons, Parsons was the engine that powered the Big Bang Theory into television history. The CBS sitcom drew nearly 18 million viewers per episode by its final years, and Parsons was its undeniable center. The actor whose portrayal of Sheldon Cooper had turned a quirky theoretical physicist into one of the most recognized characters in comedy. 4 Emmy Awards, a Golden Globe, and a position among the highest-paid performers in Hollywood. From the outside, it looked like a man occupying exactly the life he had worked for. But the schedule behind that success had been quietly compressing for years, and by the summer of 2018, it finally reached something it couldn't recover from. The pressure that summer arrived from every direction simultaneously. Parsons had committed to a Broadway revival of The Boys in the Band in New York, performing 8 shows a week while filming season 12 of the sitcom in Los Angeles at the same time. That meant regular cross-country flights, arriving on the Warner Brothers lot running on almost no sleep, delivering technically demanding comedic work, then boarding another plane back to rehearsal before the week was out. Acting on Broadway and network television in parallel is difficult enough when the rest of life stays quiet. His wasn't. At home, one of his 2 dogs, a 14-year-old animal he had shared with his husband Todd Spiewak since his early 30s, was dying. Every departure for the airport carried the real possibility of being the last time he saw the dog alive, and that guilt began attaching itself to every other obligation, pulling him in a different direction. The day things came apart happened during something as routine as a morning walk. Parsons had just flown back from Los Angeles after another round of filming and was supposed to leave almost immediately for a commercial shoot, one that an entire production crew had rearranged their own schedules to accommodate around his impossible timetable. But one look at his dog stopped him completely. 14 years of early mornings, shared routines, and quiet company were looking back at him in obvious pain, and something in Parsons simply broke open. He cried in a way he hadn't allowed himself to in a long time, not from the grind of the work, but from the realization that he had surrendered any real say in where he spent his own hours. Todd reminded him of the waiting crew. Parsons tried to keep moving and found he couldn't. The next day, he and Todd made the decision to let the dog go at home. That loss settled into him before anything else had a chance to clear. Grief rarely arrives by itself, and within days of losing the dog, Parsons was back on the Broadway stage when he felt a sharp, clean snap in his foot mid-performance. He finished the show anyway, walking out every remaining scene on a foot that turned out to be fractured, and that detail says more about his relationship with his own limits than almost anything else from that period. At the hospital, reviewing the x-rays, the fear that passed through him wasn't really about the injury. It was about fragility in a larger sense. The sudden awareness that a body pushed past its threshold eventually stops asking permission before it fails. He had been operating for years as though his capacity for endurance had no ceiling, and that fracture was the first hard evidence that it did. The thought that genuinely shook him had nothing to do with his foot. Sitting alone after the hospital visit, he let himself finish a calculation he had been circling for years. His father had died suddenly at 52, and Jim was 26 at the time, young enough to grieve without fully absorbing what the numbers meant. By the time season 12 wrapped, he would be 46, exactly 6 years younger than his father had been when he died. 6 years. That number sat in him like something cold and specific. What if the pattern repeated? What if the next decade wasn't something he could simply assume? He had spent the better part of his adult life inside the same studio, in the same wardrobe, delivering lines that had already been perfected. And the comfortable assumption he had always carried, that unlimited time was waiting somewhere on the other side of this season or this contract, suddenly felt like something he had invented to keep himself functional. Once he saw it clearly, he couldn't unsee it. That realization changed the weight of everything around him. Each table read felt different after that. Each flight back to Los Angeles carried a new question underneath it. He wasn't worn out in the conventional sense, resentful of Sheldon Cooper or tired of the people he worked with. He had built something genuine with that cast across 12 years, and he knew it. The problem was that time had stopped feeling abstract, and the idea of spending whatever years remained repeating rhythms he had already fully mastered felt like a choice he could no longer make in good conscience. One quiet Sunday, he drove to Chuck Lorre's home to say it out loud for the first time. Lorre had co-created Sheldon Cooper alongside him, and he listened without interrupting as Parsons walked through everything that had accumulated since that morning in the park. The grief, the exhaustion, the injury, the arithmetic about his father's age. When Parsons finished, Lorre didn't argue or attempt to negotiate. He acknowledged the only fact that mattered, which was that the show had no center without Sheldon, and without its center, it couldn't continue as the series it had always been. CBS and Warner Brothers accepted that conclusion within days. Season 12 would be the final one, and the announcement would reach the public on August 22, 2018. What came next was harder in a different way. Parsons gathered the main cast in his dressing room: Johnny Galecki, Kaylee Cuoco, Simon Helberg, Kunal Nair, Mayim Bialik, and Melissa Rauch, people he had spent 12 years building a specific shorthand with that only exists inside long-running ensemble work. He told them what he had told Lorre. The room went silent before the tears arrived. Galecki later admitted he felt blindsided, not because Parsons was leaving, but because the producers had heard it first. More than a decade of shared work, he felt, deserved that conversation in the other order. That reaction was honest, and Parsons understood it. What the cast eventually landed on, once the initial shock wore through, was something closer to recognition. The show had run its full course. They had all sensed it in different ways at different times. Parsons was simply the one who said it to the right person in a room that counted. The headlines that followed manufactured their own mythology, particularly a figure claiming Parsons had turned down a $50 million offer. He later clarified that no official offer at that number had ever actually been made. Negotiations for additional seasons had barely started when he drove to Lorre's house. He wasn't rejecting a specific sum. He was declining the premise, the continuation of an arrangement that had already extracted more than any salary figure could balance out. Filming the final season carried a texture that the cast described repeatedly as simultaneous gratitude and mourning. Ordinary moments became things people noticed and tried to hold rather than let pass. A shared look during a rehearsal, a joke that landed between setups, a late conversation that stretched past when everyone should have gone home. Parsons moved through each scene aware that he was closing something he had spent the better part of his working life constructing. The calm he carried wasn't detachment. It was the specific kind of relief that comes from having chosen an ending before circumstances chose it for you. The series finale aired in May 2019 to 18.5 million viewers, the largest entertainment broadcast audience of that television season. In Sheldon's closing speech, Parsons delivered gratitude for patience, for sacrifice, and for love. The words belonged to the character, but the man reading them wasn't performing from a distance. He was saying goodbye in the only way that actually works, which is when you made the choice yourself rather than having it made for you. After the show wrapped, what followed was redirection rather than retreat. The narration work on young Sheldon kept him connected to the franchise without the physical weight of being its public center, and that arrangement continued until the prequel series concluded in 2024. His performance as talent agent Henry Wilson in Ryan Murphy's Netflix series Hollywood earned him an Emmy nomination and reached audiences who had never considered him outside the sitcom context. The role was cold, calculated, and built on manipulation, everything Sheldon Cooper wasn't, and Parsons inhabited it without hesitation. In 2022, spoiler alert, gave him room to work inside themes of love and terminal illness with the kind of seriousness the sitcom format never had space for. Broadway continued drawing him back, and he returned for productions including Mother Play and Our Town in 2024, doing the stage acting he had been trained for and had never fully stopped needing. Looking at the sequence of that summer, the morning in the park, the death of a dog he had loved for 14 years, the fracture he refused to acknowledge mid-performance, the quiet calculation about his father's age at death, any single one of those events might have passed without changing anything permanently. Together, arriving in the same weeks, they produced the kind of clarity that sometimes comes only when exhaustion reaches a certain depth. Parsons saw what he had been trading away, and he stopped trading. That decision ended one of the most watched sitcoms in television history and gave him back the one thing no contract could ever put a number on: